Yeah, Pranam, thank you very much, all of you, for joining us today. My name's Stefan Evans, and I head up the Bevan Foundation's work on poverty. And I'm pleased to be chairing this afternoon's webinar that my colleagues Isis and Ella are going to lead on about the recent work we've done on people's experiences of justice in Wales. Just quickly, a little bit more about the Bevan Foundation, before I hand over to the team. For those of you not familiar with us, the Bevan Foundation is Wales's most influential think tank, and we work together for solutions to poverty and inequality in Wales. And this work today very much an integral part of that. And we'd like to thank our funders, Justice Together, and the National Lottery Awards for All, for their support that's enabled us to do this work. So thank you to them, and thank you for all of you who are on this call who also support us in many other ways. And if you're keen to find out a bit more about how you can do that, please visit our website. There's a lot of information there, as well as links to read the reports that Isis and Alec are going to be talking to today in more detail. I think that's enough for me. I'm sure you're keen to hear about the work itself. So I'll hand over to Isis. I think you're going first, aren't you? So Isis, over to you.
Thank you, Stefan. So just before I start, just a brief note about names. We're going to use real life examples of people that we spoke to in the study, in the presentation, and we didn't want to impose meaningless names on them. And so we've used abstract words from the Welsh language and names from Welsh mythology that represent something that people told us about themselves. They might not be immediately recognisable to you as names, so I just wanted to flag it at the start. Please listen out for them, and hopefully you'll recognise them as names when they come up. I'm going to talk a little bit about the study and set it in context, and then I'll hand over to my colleague Eleanor, who will summarise our findings. I'll then talk a little bit about our suggestions for the way forward, and there'll be time for questions afterwards. The recording for the webinar will be on the website after we've finished, and if anybody would like copies of the slides, please do get in touch. So firstly, for this project, we interviewed 59 people in semi-structured interviews, and we did that through a combination of individual and group discussions. We talked to people in various visa categories, and we talked to them about their experiences both of looking for legal services and of using those legal services. We wanted to know about the barriers that they experienced as they went through their search for justice, and also about the impacts of them of either not getting immigration legal advice or experiencing delays in finding it. Once we've got our findings together, we put together a working group of people, in this case, with lived experience of the asylum system, and we supported those people to develop their own recommendations and also to present those to decision makers. And we're incorporating those recommendations in our influencing as we go forward. And the report of the working group's findings and recommendations is one of 6 reports that's been produced as a result of this study. Our findings fell into 4 main themes. The first was barriers to access, which covered people's search for immigration legal advice. And the second was client care, which looked at their experiences as legal clients. That emergence of that as a major theme was a bit of a surprise to us. We didn't expect so many comments on it, but it was very evident when we were speaking to people that a lot of people were unhappy with the quality of the legal advice that they received, and also with the treatment of them by their legal representatives. The third category was interpreting, and this cut across people's entire journey to justice. Interpreting and language affected people's search for legal advice, it affected their interaction with their legal representatives, and it affected their legal cases. And the fourth area was also cross-cutting, and that's the area of restricted rights. 2 things stood out very strongly in the area of rights. One was the limited knowledge that people had about their own rights, and the second was the extent to which those rights were denied on a routine basis. And it was very evident that all of these effects work together to have a compounding effect, so that people face multiple barriers to justice. And it was evidence that these work together to have very severe effects on people's lives and long-lasting effects as well. So the study covered people's search for immigration legal advice and also their using of immigration advice. And we refer to that loosely as the journey to justice. But it's important to note that it's not a straight road from A to B. When we talked to people, they talked about experiencing repeated delays, They very often had cases refused and had to go to appeal. They had hearings that were adjourned, sometimes due to a legal representative not turning up or not submitting key evidence. And they often found a legal representative only to lose them again. It was evident when we spoke to people that representatives didn't stay for the whole journey through somebody's legal case. And quite often, at key stages in their legal case, they were left abandoned and having to scrabble to find a legal representative all over again. And then when people did receive status, they very often have to change or renew that status. So they would receive status and it would be a short period of time before they had to go back into the system over again. So it worked like a treadmill in which people went round and round and round. And one illustration of that is Gobaith, who was in the UK for 10 years before she realised that she could claim asylum. So she didn't have any legal status for that time. She experienced abuse from a violent landlord. And she then found an unscrupulous advisor who tried to charge her and her husband £3,800 for what was unlawful advice. When she did finally claim asylum, she went through an abusive experience in asylum accommodation. And since then, she's been repeatedly paying for legal advice. So that's just one example of the way in which multiple barriers affect people as they go through their journey. And at the end of it, many people don't find justice at all. Over 1 in 10 of the people that we spoke to had found a legal representative, but too late to help them with their immigration legal case. I'll now hand over to my colleague, Elle.
Thank you, Aista. Hello, everyone. I'm Eleanor Matty, and I'm the Access to Justice Policy and Research Officer. I'm going to jump straight in. So one of the main experiences which emerged from the study were the barriers to accessing justice. Of the people we spoke to, 40% of those seeking legal help with a case had been unable to find assistance. And of these, 50% were seeking asylum. Many people didn't know where to go for legal representation, and others didn't know that they even needed a legal advisor. A lack of availability for legal immigration services was a barrier to access. People reported that solicitors weren't taking referrals or they weren't open to new cases. The lack of provision outside of legal aid services was also a factor. International students and their dependents most commonly have cases which fall outside the scope of legal aid, and 61% of the international students we spoke to had found difficulties in finding that legal advice. Many people reported that where free services were unavailable, high costs prevented or restricted access to justice. 1 in 2 of the international students that we spoke to were unable to afford the cost of legal advice. One person was quoted £1,200 for a legal representative to write to the Home Office on their behalf. High costs also restricted access for people who fall within the scope of legal aid but were unable to find a legal aid solicitor. One person used scholarship money from university to pay for a legal representative to take forward their asylum claim, but noted that the cost of private solicitors is quite expensive. Legal immigration provision is mostly concentrated in the southeast of Wales, and so not having services nearby or having to travel to those services makes access difficult. Anis spent 3 months in Snowdonia and had no access to transportation, which meant that they had no access to any legal advice services for the time that they were there. Some people experienced issues with the initial communication with the legal representatives in terms of not receiving a response as to whether they can take on their case, but also in terms of language barriers preventing that initial communication. One person told us that it had taken 1.5 years to find the legal help that he needed because of those language barriers. Responses as to how people were treated by their legal representative centred around similar issues. Lack of communication from a legal representative or advisor was a major concern for many of the people we spoke to, of which over 1/3 of the people seeking sanctuary raised concerns about the availability of their legal representative or how they communicated with them. In particular, concerns were raised about not being able to see a representative face to face, not hearing from representatives for long periods of time, and not receiving regular updates. Indig had been detained pending deportation and was unable to call their solicitor. Having sent an email, they received an automatic response and was left without any legal help. Empowerment and client choice was also an important experience for the people we spoke to. Those who had experienced poor service were aware of the shortage in immigration legal provision, but they thought of themselves as lucky for having found that representation. Many people had not been given the opportunity to become active participants in the decision-making on their case, or felt as though their legal representative had underestimated the need to explain the legal aspect of their cases. Gwynllew had received a decision, but their legal representative hadn't explained what that decision meant, and they had to figure it out for themselves. And Emma said that the most important thing that a solicitor can do is to sit with him and to guide him. Equally, those who said they had a good experience with their legal representative said that they had been informative of the legal process and the development and progress of their case. For some people, the treatment from their legal representative helped to restore hope after a demonizing experience. Other people expressed that their legal representative lacked compassion or failed to see them as an individual because of the heavy demand for their services. A large proportion of the people we spoke to raised poor practice as an issue. A third of the people seeking sanctuary said their solicitor had made a mistake with their legal case. Many people experienced their representative suddenly stopping their representation, and sometimes this was without any explanation. Dropping clients abruptly can impact legal cases, and it causes significant stress to those who experience it. Where legal aid firms closed or stopped providing legal aid funded services, several people were told that their solicitor could continue their representation on the basis that they paid. Interpreters are usually appointed to those seeking sanctuary whose first language is not English. They're used by solicitors in interviews, by the Home Office in their interviews, and also in court. This is because it's really important that people are able to understand what's being asked of them and they're able to fully express themselves when answering. The role of interpreters is therefore really important because they facilitate all communication at really key stages of the asylum process. But language continued to be a barrier for many of the people we spoke to, even after they'd found legal representation. Of the people we spoke to who had used an interpreter, a very high proportion said that the interpreter had translated incorrectly, which led to mistakes being made. In some cases, the significance of these mistakes led to refusals for applications of asylum and for humanitarian protection, and in other cases, it led to delays. People frequently experienced interpreters using a different language to them. Even subtle differences in dialect and regional accents can affect the crucial details in asylum decision-making. Tavod was allocated a Spanish interpreter, but the dialect in Latin American is different, which led to an eventual refusal and delays. A shortage in experienced Home Office interpreters in various languages increases the likelihood of these mistakes happening. Mudvi had his interview cancelled twice because they were unable to find an interpreter who spoke his first language, and was later allocated an interpreter who spoke his second language. Mudvi later found out that the interpreter had only been learning that language for 2 years and was frustrated that this was considered an acceptable standard for such life-changing decisions. Some people said their interpreter manipulated what they said or openly challenged it in interviews. Some people had such a bad experience with interpreters that they would record the interview themselves so that they're able to fact check for mistakes afterwards or use as evidence if need be. The study found that a few people had experienced interpreters as the unofficial gatekeepers to accessing legal advice. Translators in some cases were the messengers between clients and solicitors, providing information on interview dates and information on cases. Solicitor firms sometimes pay interpreters commission to find clients, and there is some evidence which suggests that interpreters on commission may be abusing their power and exploiting people financially or sexually. One person's experience with interpreters controlling access to legal help suggested a risk of sexual exploitation. Kandelu said that women are sometimes advised to seek legal advice by using a WhatsApp group where women are encouraged to post beautiful pictures of themselves in order to attract the attention of an interpreter who may be able to connect them with a legal firm. A few people said that an interpreter help them on where to get help. So it's really, really important that we note the value of interpreters in terms of providing support and being a source of information. Thank you, and I'll pass you back to my colleague Esther.
The last area we looked at was the theme of rights. And we found that a lot of people that we spoke to didn't know what their legal rights were. They often didn't know what to expect from a legal representative. They didn't know how to identify quality services, and they often didn't know what their legal representative was doing or what to do about that. And for many people, regulation is failing. So they didn't know how to complain to their legal representative, and most people that we spoke to didn't understand what a regulator was or how to complain to a regulator. And they didn't feel sufficiently protected anyway to complain. Legal representatives have a lot of power, and particularly in an environment where legal services are very sparse and very short, people didn't feel confident enough to be able to complain in case they lost their representative or their representative did something wrong with their case. Levels of exploitation were very, very high, and we heard some extreme cases. For example, the case of Taliesin, who came to the UK as an unaccompanied child, encountered a bogus solicitor who stole his asylum support money and left him street homeless. And there were numerous examples of people who'd paid huge amounts of money for legal services. But what we did note was that when we spoke to people about their rights, they were really, first of all, surprised that they had rights. And secondly, lots and lots of people wanted to know more about their rights. And that's reflected in the working group recommendations. And they've made some very important recommendations about informing people about their rights and how to do that. So the impacts, almost everybody we spoke to had experienced multiple impacts of trying to find justice and of the barriers to justice. A lot of them were financial. A lot of people were in poverty, facing poverty or in debt, either as a direct result of the high costs that they faced in trying to pay for legal advice, or because of financial exploitation, or because they had lost rights. For example, a lot of people had lost the right to work or had lost employment sponsorship. There were impacts on people's legal cases. Istid, for example, was wrongly detained, but without any access to legal justice or any access to the outside world. It was a long time before she could challenge that successfully. And another big area that we found was the impacts on health, particularly on mental health. A lot of the participants in the study had experienced depression or emotional distress. Helaeth, for example, spoke about being mentally destabilised by her search for justice and at times being completely unable to engage with her family. And the impacts on children were significant. A quarter of the participants we spoke to who were outside of the asylum system mentioned that their children had been affected negatively by their inability to access justice. And most of all, we found that these impacts compounded each other. So the example of Gobaith, who I spoke about earlier, she was pregnant, she had no legal status, and without representation, she couldn't regularise that status, which led her to be threatened with physical violence by her landlord and ultimately homelessness. So what can we do about it? One of the obvious answers is legal aid reform. And the immigration and legal aid system definitely needs reforming. As well as higher fees and better administration, we also need client-focused reforms. And the working group made a recommendation to ensure that legal clients get given copies of the agreements with their solicitor and with the client care letters, for example. But it's not all about legal aid. There's a desperate need for provision outside of the current scope of legal aid. Most immigration was cut from the scope of legal aid in 2012, and the so-called safety net that exists in the form of exceptional case funding isn't being used. Previous research that we did showed that most legal aid contractors in Wales don't provide exceptional case funding. And if we think about the funding outside of legal aid, for example, the Single Advice Fund was recently announced by the Welsh Government. And that includes virtually no provision for immigration legal aid. And what is in there is restricted to level 1 of IAA, which was formerly OISC. Development and training is very much needed, and there's a need to build services from the ground up. There's a desperate shortage of legal professionals in Wales. We need to protect people's rights. And again, the working group have made several recommendations about how to ensure that people get access to their rights, and particularly about putting lots of rights information in places where people go regularly so that they get small chunks of rights information and they're able to take that in on an ongoing basis. And we need to listen to experience. In consultations and reviews, we need to listen to people with lived experience of the migration system, but we also need to embed experience through the sector. And again, the working group made some recommendations about ensuring that people with lived experience of the migration system are able to work as advisors, representatives, and interpreters. And finally, we need a strategic approach. The study shows that the immigration legal system in Wales is not fit for purpose, and that's reflected in many areas of the UK. It's really important that governments and providers and local authorities and people with lived experience of the system come together and work strategically to rebuild the sector, but also to connect people with legal services. And I'll now hand over to Stefan and we'll go to questions. And thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much, both. Yeah, I think that was quite powerful reading, I think, in terms of, yeah, really highlighting the challenges out there that are facing a lot of people. I can see people have already been sending in questions, so please continue to do so using the Q&A. I guess one question, maybe at the first question we got in kind of touches maybe on something broader about, from Emmy Chater, the question was asking about if people aren't aware of their rights, how are they aware that they've had poor legal advice? So I guess I think you've answered some of that later on in the presentation about kind of being able to access, etc. But how did people become aware that the advice that they'd been given was wrong or bad, I guess?
So some of it. So there are two things about rights. Firstly, people didn't know about their rights with the legal representative. So, for example, many people we spoke to, when we asked them about client care letters or what agreements about what their solicitor was going to do, they didn't remember being given a client care letter. They had no idea what their solicitor was going to do. So in that aspect, they didn't know that those rights were being abused. In some cases, it was very obvious that their solicitor hadn't done anything at all. And it was difficult sometimes to distinguish between genuine solicitors and unscrupulous advisors who weren't regulated. But I think in both cases, sometimes the actions that they were expected didn't happen. It was obvious to people that they hadn't received the service they expected if they went to court, for example, and their representative didn't turn up, or if they hadn't submitted evidence. So there were some issues that were really obvious and they could tell they were getting a bad treatment. For a lot of people, it was about being able to see their solicitor face to face. So we heard an example of one person, for example, who sat outside the solicitor's office, desperately trying to see them and was completely ignored when the solicitor arrived. And people repeatedly said that they wanted to talk to their representative to understand what was happening, and they couldn't do so. And a lot of that is about the overloading of the system rather than solicitors being bad.
Could I also add something on to that as well? I think there's a difference as well in terms of people knowing their rights and in terms of whether they've had poor legal advice and the difference in that. But the fact that a third of the people we spoke to seeking sanctuary said that the solicitor had made a mistake, mistakes become quite evident based on the outcome of that mistake. So whether that's a refusal, delays, that's still relevant. So where they might not know that they have rights in terms of how to complain about legal representatives, they've still experienced those mistakes and that poor practice.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you very much. And I guess that leads to, if I'm going to abuse my chair's privilege, question I've been turning in my own mind actually about kind of, you've got potentially in terms of needing to increase that overall availability of advice, but also if a lot of the advice currently available isn't of particularly good quality, not necessarily some of those people are the people you might want to be doing that. So you touched there, Isis, in terms of, do you think just increasing availability would in part improve the quality as well?
It would in part because a lot of that, and this came out in our previous research into legal aid provision as well, that a lot of the providers we were speaking to were saying they didn't have the time to provide the client care that they wanted to. So a lot of it is simply about overwork and people working over capacity. But there is an element of, I think what came across was a feeling that people were being treated as though they should be grateful to have immigration advice, and I think there is an onus on providers to really think about the quality of care that they provide as well. But that's very difficult to do within a broken system.
Yeah, thanks. We've got catch up with a few of these. So Rachel Morris asked the question. I think I've seen a few people come in about interpreters, of unsurprisingly, given the kind of how powerful what you shared there was. Rachel was asking, obviously understands that you're not going to name names in this sort of forum, but was there kind of common trends in terms of which sort of organizations, businesses, individuals, or was this an across the board problem?
It was an across the board problem. And I don't know if Al wants to come in on this as well, but it was both in terms of people talked about the the interpreters that they had with the Home Office, but also the interpreters that they had with legal representatives. And a lot of people talked about not having interpreters at all. So that impacted when people tried to come to a solicitor and explain what the problem was, or to a legal representative. They often couldn't make themselves understood, and they often found themselves communicating with their legal representative through Google Translate or some other online service, which didn't really do the job properly. And I don't think you can effectively provide a legal service doing that.
I was going to say it was very much across the board. Whilst there were some people without interpreters, the vast majority of the people predominantly claiming asylum had some sort of experience with interpreters, which was quite a surprising finding, really, throughout the study, to hear actually how across the board that experience is, but in court with Home Office interpreters, and as well with solicitor interviews too.
Yeah.
And I think as well, the other thing that came through was when interpreters made mistakes, it very often wasn't picked up either by legal representatives or by the Home Office, and that could have catastrophic effects on somebody's case.
Absolutely. Kind of moving us on slightly, we've got two different but related questions here. One from an anonymous attendee, and I think one was by Emmy Chater. So the question from the anonymous attendee was around, you've talked about the need to rebuild the legal aid, immigration legal aid sector, but obviously the obvious question would be, where's the money come in for that? So that's one challenge possibly for you to consider. And then Emmy's question was that, even if you got to the point where we were able to do that, get the money into the system, etc., it's going to take time. That's not going to happen overnight. So, leads to the question of what do you do in the interim then? Whilst he hopes. So there's maybe a question there about what are the short-term fixes that we might be able to do whilst we try and rebuild the system like we want to, and where might the money come from to do that longer-term rebuild?
Okay, so that's a big question. I'll start with money first. So ultimately, I think a lot of money has to come from central government. The scope of immigration legal aid is not wide enough, but there also is a need for Welsh Government to do a lot more. When you think about the Single Advice Fund and the very, very limited provision for immigration legal aid in there, I think we haven't grasped the nettle, and people aren't really taking adequate account of how destructive the lack of access to immigration legal justice is for society and for social justice impacts. And I should say that the Welsh Government has put some money into the legal aid sector, but it's quite limited how much of that goes to direct legal advice. So there's devolved government, central government. I think trusts and foundations have to do a lot more. Some are doing excellent work in this area, but Wales is still very underfunded. We have very high needs and high poverty, but we get less than our fair share of trust funding. But I think local authorities as well, and Dr. Jo Wilding produced an excellent report. It called It's a No-Brainer, which went into the cost benefits for local authorities of funding legal advice. But a big chunk of it does have to come from central government, and we can't, I don't think there are other sources that can replace the loss of immigration legal aid funding that went in 2012. Sorry, I've lost track of the rest of the question.
I guess in terms of are there stuff that we could do in the shorter term, I guess, to plug the gaps whilst we get the reform we don't want to see.
I think it was, I think as things stand, one of the main things that could be done would be strategically trying to link people up with legal services. So people are very often left on their own looking for legal services. A lot of organisations are working very hard in that area, but it would be good to have something central where we can bring together what solicitors are available, where, so we've got better networking in terms of that. And there was a really good recommendation from the working group about a government funded resource that would actually enable people to see in real time what providers are available and where they can get legal advice from. And development is really, really key. So getting that development and training up and running and seeing where maybe we can develop more legal services in frontline organisations, because it's not all about the formal solicitor sector. There's a third sector there which is really lacking as well. We have very few third sector organisations which offer immigration advice in Wales, and it would be really good to see how we can support and develop those to build up those services.
Yeah, absolutely. Kind of a linked question to that last bit you were developing there actually is around, I think it's Francis Timberlake that mentions kind of was struck about the barriers you mentioned in terms of accessing or using the complaints process when someone's been poorly represented. And she was wondering, did you have any thoughts, or did the group have any thoughts about how could you make that complaints process easier for people to access and use if they've had that poor quality, both for their own benefit, but also maybe to prevent that person operating in that way in future as well.
And I think the first thing, the key thing is that people are made aware that they can complain. If they don't know that they can do that, it's not going to happen. And I think that needs to be priority in terms of ensuring that people are able to complain about legal advisors where they need to.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely true. And I was shocked by the number of people who said they had no idea that they were supposed to receive some of the things they're supposed to receive from the legal representative. And there might be an element of that which is about trauma, because people are going through a very traumatic period and they can't always remember when they're given a piece of information. But I think a lot of people were not receiving that information from their legal representative that they should be receiving. And it's no point really having rights to complain if you don't know that you've got a right to complain and you're not told how to do it. So it's informing people and not just relying on legal representatives to inform people, making sure that people get that information in other places. What the working group talked about with us was how, for example, if we take asylum seekers, how people go to a particular place in asylum accommodation to eat, and they were saying it would be really good to have screens up in those areas, to have lots of small bits of information where people are coming, so that every time they go to that place, they're seeing the information about their rights. Every time they're going to a doctor's surgery or a waiting room, they're seeing information about their rights, and it can come through in that drip, drip, drip effect, and people can talk about it as a group and they can get support from other people who are seeking asylum as well. That's easier maybe with asylum seekers than it is with other groups of students, but international students, for example, universities could be providing that information, and there just needs to be a lot more of it in a lot more places and and given in a much more manageable form so that people can take it in.
Yeah, thanks. I've got a question here from an anonymous attendee asking about access to remote that issue that people had in terms of getting access to that advice from a solicitor, getting answers, etc. And this person was asking, is that something that we perhaps need to develop further in terms of having more resources available for people who might struggle to attend at particular times? Was there anything that came out of that?
Well, I think that's a tricky one. As things stand, there is a need for more remote advice simply because people can't access it, but it's a sticking plaster, it's not a solution. a lot of, I'm sure Elle will agree with me on this, that a lot of people that we spoke to, one of their key issues was that they couldn't see their solicitor, or they couldn't see their legal representative. They didn't know what they were doing. They were trying to get appointments and able to get appointments. And so there's the issue of people having to travel long distances to get legal advice. People were traveling to London, Manchester, Southampton, for example. And in that case, you might say, okay, it's better to have remote advice than to have no advice at all. But the only reason really you need remote advice is because there isn't enough advice. So I do worry a little bit, for example, about there's something in the legal aid consultation that's open at the moment about taking away or reducing the requirement for people to have an office. I worry that that might lead to less face-to-face advice, and people in very vulnerable and traumatic situations really need that face-to-face advice.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think remote advice could help in some ways and for some people. But a lot of people are quite vulnerable, and they, like I just said, you do need that face-to-face interaction. I don't think it's sustainable, and it doesn't address the root cause, which is that there just aren't enough providers. And to meet demand and provide greater access to people, we do need more providers. We need an attractive market for those providers and a sustainable and profitable legal aid sector. And we also need that capacity building within the third sector, as I said earlier, so that access is on the ground. It's not just remote, but in the meantime, it can help, but I don't think it's the solution.
And outreach advice is very, very useful. I think if more legal representatives could go into places where people are receiving support, that would help. But obviously that needs funding as well.
I'm aware that time's rapidly running away from us, so I'm going to try and get as many of your questions in as possible. And apologies in advance if I don't get yours. But one that's just come in is from Hazel Boyles, who asks, you haven't mentioned the Right to Remain toolkit. Do you think that promoting that would be helpful?
Oh, absolutely. Lots of people mentioned the Right to Remain toolkit when we spoke to them. Though quite a few people had seen that and said it was useful, particularly people who'd already been through the system and helped other migrants in finding legal advice talked about that. So that is really useful. And that's an example of remote advice that does help. But in terms of representation, I think we need more face-to-face stuff. So in terms of engaging rights and encouraging people to know more of their rights, those kind of things are really helpful.
I've got then here a question, an interesting question from Kate Smart from Settled, who's asking what more do you think organizations like hers can do to help address the issues that you've outlined in the work?
Well, Settle's providing some very good legal advice. I would say that's really good. I suppose maybe one of the things that all of us can think about is how we link up more and work together more, because I think there's a really good we might get more out of. For example, us as an influencing organisation, a policy organisation, if we have more contact with organisations who are delivering direct advice, we can help to promote those issues. Organisations who are delivering advice and organisations who are finding people, helping people to find that advice. If we work together more, maybe we could signpost people more effectively. I don't know. So I think I haven't got an answer. But certainly I think by talking more and working together more, we can probably find one. So yeah, please get in touch and we'll have a chat.
I on that kind of talking together note, actually, there's a question from Helen Hayes who asks that currently the Welsh Government brings together an EU-SS coordination group, which includes some third sector providers of immigration advice. Would this be an avenue for information sharing / coordination?
All of those kinds of groups are avenues for information sharing, and yes, that is something we've attended as well, and we only recently started attending it actually, and we'll continue to do so. But yeah, all of those kind of forums are useful. A statutory NRPF forum for Wales would be another useful avenue. There are lots of working groups and cross-party groups that are there. But I think it's really important that we we look at how we can bring migration and migration issues and justice issues into the mainstream sector and not keep looking at it as something separate. And the other thing that probably didn't come out of the presentation, but which came up in the research, was how important other forms of legal advice and representation are as well, and how lacking they are for migrants. So yeah, all of that is really important that we keep talking.
Yeah, thanks, Lisa. There are a heap of questions, and I'm not going to do justice to all of them. So I was just going to say I'd recommend to everyone take a look in terms of some of the conversations that's been happening. It's been great to see people talking back and forth in there as well, and lots of people echoing kind of a lot of the sentiment that's come out in the presentation today and in the reports that underpin it. But I think time has beaten us otherwise, I am sad to say. So I just want to thank every one of you who've joined us today, and also in particular thank Ellen Leicester for all their work. And I'm sure both would be more than happy to carry on the discussion with anyone after today if we didn't get to your question, or if we've provoked an idea or a thought about that you want to explore further. Please get in touch with us, and we'd be delighted to carry on the conversation. But otherwise, I just leave you to say thank you very much for joining us, and I'm sure we'll see you again soon. Cheers. Diolch.